So the Commonwealth funds an organisation whose job is to lobby the Commonwealth. And what do they recommend? They recommend lowering the voting age to 16 and requiring all AI funding to, and this is their phrase, have a gendered lens. These are just a few examples, but remember this category is $1 billion large, and I'm only giving you examples about what they brag about on their website, right? Let alone what they do in private and never report.
I'm delighted to host you as we give you an advance briefing of the latest major report of the IPA's Reinvigorating Democracy project, Stacking the Deck, how the government lobbies itself and funds the distortion of democracy. And Jordan will shortly walk you through the report, but I just wanted to spend a few minutes to put this work into the broader context of the IPA's democracy research program. The task of reinvigorating Australian democracy is so important right now. Just this week, the full court of the Federal Court handed down an extraordinary decision in which it rejected an appeal brought forward by Senator Pauline Hanson against an earlier decision which found she had breached Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. You might recall the background to this case, but just to briefly summarise, it all began when Senator Maureen Faruqi made a malicious and mean-spirited comment about Queen Elizabeth II on the day Her Majesty died, saying, and I quote, "I cannot mourn the leader of a racist empire built on stolen lives, land, and wealth of colonised peoples. We are reminded of the urgency of treaty with First Nations, justice and reparations for British colonies and becoming a republic," which prompted Senator Hanson to say, and I quote, "Your attitude appalls and disgusts me. When you immigrated to Australia, you took every advantage of this country. You took citizenship, bought multiple homes and a job in a parliament. It's clear you're not happy, so pack your bags and piss off back to Pakistan." Now, maybe not so much in this room, but you may or may not agree with what Senator Hanson said, and you may not agree with how she said it. And frankly, as someone with great affection and loyalty for the late Queen, I can certainly understand the passion of the rebuttal. But what we are seeing here is how the law can be weaponised by a politician on the left against a politician on the right. And if they can use the law against someone as prominent as Senator Hanson, then they can get anyone, anywhere, who dares to say something that might offend someone else. In other words, this case reveals just how vulnerable our ability to have a free and fair debate actually is. And this is what a vigorous democracy is all about. The ability to have a free and fair debate and to have an electoral system that allows people to exercise a free choice, which results in the preferences and priorities of mainstream Australians being represented in our institutions. These are the guiding principles of the Reinvigorating Democracy project. The first major report of this project was The Rise of the Insiders, which catalogued the backgrounds and life experiences of federal parliamentarians and charted the declining representation of those with mainstream backgrounds. The Canberra bubble, it turns out, is a real thing. And this helps explain why the priorities of the political class are so far afield of where the community might expect them to be. But that's just one part of the equation. After all, is it not true that politicians want, above all, to be elected and re-elected? So the adoption of positions which are marginal or niche would seem to be counterintuitive. Politicians are fundamentally reactive, and what they typically react to is information. Information they believe to be politically important. But what happens when that information ecosystem is distorted? Then their understanding of what is important is also distorted. This, in my view, helps explain, in part, the troubles of the coalition parties and why the right of centre politics is in such upheaval. This information ecosystem has been fundamentally slanted in a leftward direction, and the inability of incumbent parties on the right to penetrate and understand that distortion and speak directly to the mainstream has left them politically adrift. Earlier I mentioned how laws such as 18C empower the government to distort public debate by silencing the voice of some people. This new research looks at the other side of the coin, how government amplifies the voice of other people. And it's not random. As our research finds, the government supports progressive advocacy with no comparable examples to be found on the other side of the policy spectrum. Between the financial years of 2021 and 2025, state and federal governments, by way of unelected bureaucrats, have systematically funneled not millions of dollars, not hundreds of millions of dollars, but billions of dollars of taxpayer money to non-government organisations who have a key purpose in advocacy. In other words, the government is paying non-government groups to lobby back to the government to promote progressive ideas that generally have little support in the wider community. So Jordan will explore the numbers in more detail, but I wanted to pull just one example out, which really encapsulates the perverse and absurd nature of this phenomenon. In 2023, ahead of the Voice referendum that year, I published a short research paper which identified one NGO, Reconciliation Australia, the principal lobby group for constitutional recognition, were funded by governments to run its campaigns. The analysis found that between 2012 and 2017, Reconciliation Australia received roughly $25 million in government funding to run the campaign entity Recognise. And between 2017 and 2022, the time in which the chosen model of recognition became The Voice, another $30 million in government funding was committed. This analysis highlighted this as another example of the government giving favourable treatment to the Yes campaign in a debate that should only be answered by the Australian people, which ultimately occurred in October 2023 when the nation overwhelmingly rejected the proposal to insert the voice into the Constitution. In this new research, we consider the issue of indigenous self-determination advocacy, also known as co-governance advocacy. This is the principle that mandates that Indigenous Australians are fundamentally and categorically different to other Australians and therefore require separate institutions, political representation and rights than other Australians. This is the basic underlying principle of The Voice, a parallel organ for political representation along racial lines. And what is really interesting is in the 2024 financial year, co-governance advocacy NGOs received roughly $15 million from taxpayers to promote these ideas. This was the year that the referendum took place and in which Australians overwhelmingly rejected these ideas. So you would think that those responsible for making these decisions about how to spend our money might reassess whether or not that was a worthwhile project. But instead, they are doubling down. Actually, they're more than doubling down. The year after the referendum, government funding for this sector increased by 159% to almost 40 million. And if you're wondering why after The Voice we are still dealing with debates about treaty, about truth-telling, about the other limbs of the Uluru Statement of the Heart, or about other two-tier policies like intangible cultural heritage laws, well, this might shed some light on it. This is just one example from the report. We assessed a sample of 100 NGOs in multiculturalism advocacy, nanny state and public health advocacy, welfare state advocacy, and green advocacy, which tell a persistently similar story. NGOs engaged in pushing progressive ideas, receiving a large and increasing amount of money from taxpayers who are mostly unaware of it and would be horrified to learn of it. But we will tell them, because they need to know how democracy is being distorted in their name. A final note about reform. Clearly, as a first step, this must not happen. The funding must stop and tighter legislative safeguards around how government dispenses grants are needed. However, we must also consider how and why this phenomenon has come about. Politicians listen to NGOs because the connection between voting and representation has been severed. Australia's bizarre rules about compulsory preferential voting, for instance, compel Australians to participate in the electoral process and assign their preferences, effectively forcing people to vote for candidates they likely do not know and would not support. For the politician, you don't need to be the best candidate. You just have to be the second worst candidate, or be fortunate enough that a random assignment of preferences falls your way. Politicians aren't responsive to the actual community because the system disincentivizes it. This is why the Reinvigorating Democracy project is first and foremost interested in more comprehensive democracy reform. Right now, the Queensland State Government is committed to following New South Wales by introducing optional preferential voting. This would be a significant improvement on compulsory preferential voting by giving more choice to voters to express their political preferences, and an important step in what we would like to see as a broader nationwide reform agenda. Over the next year, our commitment is to make this the focus of the Reinvigorating Democracy project, to promote the virtues of voter choice, to model its potential impacts on future elections, and to turn it into a national story. Thank you for your support of this important research, and it gives me great pleasure now to hand over to Jordan to walk you through the research in more detail. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jordan Abizaid, and before I start, I'd like to thank our Director of Research, Morgan Begg, for his support of me personally and his work on this project more broadly. I want to thank all of you as well. Everything you hear today exists because people like you choose to support it. To start, the Australians that I know have a vague sense that the democratic game isn't fair. When they talk to people in their own lives, at work, at the pub, and at the school gate, they find that far fewer people support the politically progressive policies that are publicly proclaimed by the political class. Yet they feel like the deck is stacked against them. And it is, but they don't have the answers as to how. This report is one small step in resolving that vague sense. It shows Australians exactly how the government uses NGO funding to manipulate public debate and stack the deck. So today I'm going to show you that amount of NGO advocacy funding. Then I'm going to highlight the two largest categories in detail and summarise the others, and show you what they use some of that funding for. And then I'm going to close with suggesting some ideas about what can be done about it. So we identified 100 organisations that receive government funding and engage in public advocacy as a major or majority function of what they do. Let me be clear about what this project is not. There are plenty of NGOs that the government funds that do bad things and should be defunded, but sadly that is beyond the scope of this project. The focus here is much narrower and I think much more damning. Organisations that the government funds that then turn around and lobby the government. And we've organised them into 5 different categories and tracked them across 5 financial years, from 2020 to 21 to 24 to 25. And those 5 categories are diversity and multiculturalism advocacy, nanny state and public health advocacy, lawfare and welfare state advocacy, environmental advocacy, and indigenous co-governance advocacy. The data for this research comes from annual information statements lodged with the Australian Charities and Non-for-Profits Commission. And one more thing before I show you the final number. This analysis is deliberately conservative. We excluded a great many number of service organisations that also, service delivery organisations that also engage in advocacy on the side, because we wanted to focus on bodies that are predominantly or majorly focused on political advocacy. And the 100 we chose are a sample. This analysis is not exhaustive of all of the funding. Whatever we conclude tonight, the real figure is larger than the one I'm about to give you. $2.24 billion. $2.24 billion of government money, of taxpayers' money, over 5 years to 100 organisations whose business is telling government what to do. In the last financial year alone, it cost $564 million. In 2020 to 21, it was $352 million. That is a 60% growth in 5 years. 60% ain't bad. I imagine there's quite a few small businesses out there in Victoria who would kill for 60% growth in 5 years. But they don't have the luxury of being funded by the government. They actually have to go out and create value for Australians, unlike these NGOs. So these 5 categories, that funding is concentrated. So 10 organisations take 56% of that money. So again, this is not 1,000 small community groups getting money from government. This is a small number of very large, well-resourced and professional bodies conducting political advocacy. And not only is that $2.24 billion an enormous number, but taxpayer funding of advocacy runs in only one direction, and that is to the progressive left. We were unable in our analysis to find a single case of government funding for explicitly right-leaning advocacy organisations, Unsurprisingly rather, the government is not funding advocacy organisations who think Australia needs less immigration, that we need more coal and gas to give Australians cheap, reliable power, or that we shouldn't divide Australians by race and instead rally around our flag and our heritage. Of course, they fund none of that, and they fund all of the other, which has the effect of stacking public debate. This is effectively the government astroturfing. It has the effect of misleading the public and policymakers about community attitudes to policy issues. So I want to explain that the problem is greater than simply wasting taxpayer money, although that is very, very bad on its own. It has a negative effect on democracy. It crowds out the debate of Australian citizens. If you're a private citizen with a view of immigration or energy or what your children are taught in your schools, you have your evenings and you have your weekends to engage in that advocacy. These organisations have staff, communication teams, lawyers, and a guaranteed income from the government to conduct their advocacy with. This, of course, then creates a sort of manufactured consensus. When a parliamentary inquiry receives 40 submissions and 35 of them all say the same thing, it looks like public opinion is settled on that issue. Now, of course, it isn't. That's the same funding stream speaking through 35 different puppets. But lawmakers are then led to form a misleading picture of what Australians think. And somehow Australians are made to feel as if their mainstream views are somehow marginal. Additionally, the ideological bias of these organisations creates a closed loop. Ideologically progressive governments fund an organisation. That organisation then lobbies government. Government then cites that organisation as evidence of what they wanted to do all along. And the opposite also occurs when a government finally comes in that is elected and doesn't share the same ideological frame of these progressive institutions, and they want to change some of these policies. All of a sudden, hundreds of quote-unquote community organisations, peak bodies, etc., come out of the woodwork demanding the changes be abandoned. Sadly, all too often governments then go running, thinking there is a community backlash that doesn't actually exist. Now, I'd like to give some practical examples of this effect. The first is diversity and multiculturalism. The largest category by far, their total is just over $1 billion over 5 years. The Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils Australia, also known as FECA, and its local bodies are the clearest example of this advocacy. So you have Multicultural Communities Council on the Gold Coast, $60.8 million over 5 years. Illawarra, $52.7 million. The Ethnic Communities Council of Queensland, $35.9 million. The Multicultural Council of Wagga Wagga was given $4 million. I've never been to Wagga Wagga. I'm sure it's a fantastic place, but I'm unsure if a city of 60,000 people needs its own multicultural lobbying outfit funded by the government. FECA has lobbied for embedding audience diversity and cultural inclusion across Australia's arts and cultural sector to increase inclusion. Of course, if you're an artist or you're producing films, you should be choosing who you want in your films based off artistic merit, your own personal vision, what's beautiful, what's good. But these people are lobbying for something else. They are lobbying for specific groups to be put in for the sake of diversity. Similarly, they've advocated for maintaining a minimum refugee intake of 20,000 per year and, quote, legislating multiculturalism as a core Australian value. All of these things are things Australians are reasonably disagreed on. You can say there's a variety of viewpoints on this. And so for the government to simply fund one side of the debate and not fund the other is highly inappropriate. Another example is the National Women's Alliances, or the Working for Women's program. The Working for Women's program distributes grant funding that, quote, supports their goal of improving outcomes for women and gender equality in Australia. That sounds very reasonable, sounds like a noble goal. And how have they supported this goal? Well, they have spent $3 million to, quote, increase women's representation in leadership in the Australian seafood industry. There is not enough female seafood CEOs, and so they have to be subsidised, and the systematic barriers that stop them have to be removed. Additionally, the purpose of National Women's Alliance, as I mentioned earlier, is to bring together these peak bodies to engage with government on policy. So the Commonwealth funds an organisation whose job is to lobby the Commonwealth. And what do they recommend? They recommend lowering the voting age to 16 and requiring all AI funding to, and this is their phrase, have a gendered lens. So I don't know who's going to build the AI tools of the future, but if these guys get their way, it certainly won't be Australians, because there will be so many rules and regulations in the way that no one will build anything. These are just a few examples, but remember, this category is $1 billion large. There's $1 billion pumping out advocacy just like that, and I'm only giving you examples about what they brag about on their website, right? Let alone what they do in private and never report. The second largest category, here we go, is Nanny, state and public health. The Cancer Councils received 373.7 million over 5 years, 87.8 million in the last financial year alone. Now, the Cancer Council is a prominent advocate for government control, regulations on how smoking is depicted in films, plain packaging, regulating e-cigarettes, higher alcohol excise, warning labels, food labelling, and restrictions on marketing food to children. We sampled over 80 submissions the Cancer Council made to the government inquiries between 2021 and 25. Their advocacy ranged from First Nations data sovereignty, which I still am not quite sure what that is, to supporting internet censorship, arguing that health misinformation should be a regulatory category and responsibility for all levels of government. We saw exactly how that works during COVID. Governments during that period made enormously contestable decisions about how Australians could live. These decisions were then reinforced by ostensibly independent advocacy groups funded by the government that then lent them the appearance of a settled consensus. For example, the Consumers Health Forum praised the Commonwealth's health plan and welcomed a national media campaign urging compliance. The Public Health Association told a Senate inquiry the government's COVID response had been, quote, exemplary. Our third category is lawfare and the welfare state, which is 310 million over 5 years. Two organisations that dominate this category, with the Australian Council of Social Service and Oxfam Australia taking up collectively 198 million of that 310 million. Underneath this sits a sort of legal framework or legal network, with the Consumer Action Law Centre on 29 million, Refugee Legal on 20 million, and Law Right on 14.5 million. These bodies engage in a practice known as lawfare, using the courts to challenge laws or simply obstruct and delay government policy until it's too expensive to pursue, or choosing select specific cases that then go on and set new legal precedents. For example, Refugee Legal exists to, quote, provide free specialist legal advice to people seeking asylum, refugees, and disadvantaged migrants. In effect, their goal is to make it harder for the Commonwealth Government to deport failed asylum seekers and unlawful migrants by winning test cases that create new legal protections and obstacles to removal. In 2020, Refugee Legal's submission to Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Legislation Committee on the Migration Amendment, prohibiting items and in immigration detention facilities bill, quite a mouthful, sought to reduce the powers of the minister and migration detention staff to remove illegal or dangerous items from detention facilities. That is your money being spent arguing that people running immigration detention should have less ability to confiscate contraband. And of course, we couldn't find a single advocacy organisation dedicated to removing illegal immigrants within Australia that receives a cent of government funding. Morgan covered this one earlier in great detail, but to recap, this is the smallest category in dollar terms, being indigenous co-governance, but the fastest growing in percentage terms. Previous IPA research established that between 2012 and 2017, the federal government spent $25.73 million on Recognise, the campaign entity operated by Reconciliation Australia. Between 2017 and 2022, the period when the Voice became the settled model of constitutional recognition, Reconciliation Australia and its state affiliates received a further $30.28 million. Once again, we could not find a single advocacy organisation receiving government money that campaigned against the Voice. And environmental advocacy, almost $170 million to conservation groups, renewable energy proponents, and advocates of emissions targets reduction. This category more than doubled over the 5 years, and the Environmental Defender's Office is the sharpest angle. It routinely uses Section 487 of the EPBC Act, a provision that grants green groups a special legal privilege to challenge ministerial approvals of main projects. IPA analysis found that between 2000 and 2020, challenges under that section put $65 billion of investment at risk, holding projects up in court for a cumulative 10,100 days. And that is, of course, the point. Organisations like Greenpeace use the strategy disrupt and delay, which is to engage in lawfare whilst gradually eroding public and political support for the industry. Additionally, governments are even funding classroom materials. Since 2024, over $1 million of public money has gone to Cool Australia, which promotes school resources presenting an alarmist and emotive account of climate change to children. So what should be done? I hope I've been able to highlight just a small portion of the findings in our report today. Government-funded advocacy is just one small way that the government distorts democracy and stacks the deck. This is to say nothing of the ideological bias of other government-funded organisations whose advocacy is less obvious, though no less labyrinthian. It feels like in many ways we are up against a leviathan, some obscured and immense beast leaking beneath the water and diluting our democracy. And so what is to be done? There exists a temptation to go for a modest solution. Get governments to change the funding rules, perhaps ban political advocacy as a condition of the grant, or trim funding to some of the worst offenders. I don't think that's going to be enough. I think those measures are ultimately temporary, and they leave the underlying infrastructure intact, allowing the whole apparatus to roar back to life with a different government. The real answer is to starve the beast, to scrap government funding for organisations that lobby back to government and legislate proper safeguards around grants so it's harder for future governments to misuse their responsibility. The underlying principle is very, very simple. Lobbying government is not a core function of government, and Australian taxpayers should not be forced or compelled to fund one side of the nation's political debates. Where a function is genuinely necessary, it can continue under a new institution, with new people, and a mandate accountable to the public rather than to the activist sector. Ultimately, much of what this network produces is superfluous and should end. That's all I have for you today. Thank you very much.